Titus chapter 1, verse 1. Paul, a servant of God and apostle of Jesus Christ, for the faith of God's elect and their knowledge of the truth that leads to godliness, in the hope of eternal life that God, who cannot lie, promised before time began. In his own time, he has revealed his word in the preaching with which I was entrusted by the command of God, our Savior. To Titus, my true son in our common faith, grace and peace from God the Father and Jesus Christ, our Savior.
Good morning, church. Our last sermon bumper was like super epic, and I felt like it was like a movie trailer. And this one, I felt like a bride should be like walking down the aisle. I don't know. Maybe it's because I've done wedding videos, and I'm like, oh, that's good music for a nice wedding overview video. So anyways, good morning. Welcome again to this gathering of New Eden Church. I introduced myself earlier, but if you weren't here or you don't know who I am, my name is Joel. I get to serve as one of the pastors here at New Eden Church alongside our pastor for shepherding. And so I'm just honored to be a part of what God is doing here. If I've not met you yet, I would love to meet you after the gathering. And so if you have a few moments to hang around, I'd love to get to know you a little bit. So as we typically do here at New Eden Church, we are preaching through a book of the Bible. We do that. It's called expository preaching. And we do that because it allows us to hopefully preach the whole counsel of God and stay off maybe my own personal hobby horses. Rather, we let the text dictate what we're going to be speaking about each week. And so we are in the book of Titus. We are starting that today. We'll spend about 6 weeks in this epistle, and then we will move into an Advent series once we get into December. So a lot of times I have some story or illustration to open with. I don't have that today. And I was like, last night, I was telling these guys before, I was like, you know what, I'm tired. So we're just going to dive right in. I'm going to intro the book. We do this every time we go into a book. I spend about the first 10, 15 minutes of that sermon just introducing the book. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of context for the book of Titus. And then we're going to cover the verses that you just heard read, which is Paul's kind of self-introduction to the letter, the first 4 verses of Titus. And so this is just general understanding of a Bible study. Anytime you're studying a book of the Bible, it's helpful to just start with some very basic questions. What type of literature is the book? Who wrote the book? Who was the book written to, right? Who is the intended audience of the book? Why was the book written? What was its purpose? And often we can find those things right in the book, and especially with this book, Titus, we'll be able to do that. So we're going to just answer some of these questions. What is the book of Titus? Well, it's simply a short letter that was penned by the Apostle Paul that we'll get into in a moment. So it's called one of the pastoral epistles. Epistle simply means letter. And so this is recorded letter from the Apostle Paul. He identifies himself right away, very first word of the book, Paul, right? So in our letters, we typically put who wrote it at the very end, right? They were smarter and put it at the beginning, right? Because if you read a whole letter, you need to know who it's from, right? So they just say that right at the beginning. So the author of our book is Paul. As he writes this letter, we believe that he was under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. And so this is inspired scripture, which means that this letter has value for all churches, all times. However, he was writing it to a very specific person in a very specific context. And so knowing that can help us out. So he was writing it to a young man named Titus. Okay, that's where the book gets its name from, Titus. Titus was a co-laborer of Paul, most likely younger than him, the way Paul speaks of him. Titus doesn't get a whole lot of press in the New Testament, but Paul does reference him in some of his other letters to the church at Galatia, the church at Corinth, every time he does, he seems to speak very fondly of Titus. He seems to have a lot of respect for Titus. He entrusts Titus with a lot of things. In our text today, you're going to hear Titus referred to as Paul's true son in their common faith. So this is fond language that he's writing about Titus. Okay, but this specific letter, lest you think it's just like a nice note, an encouraging note from Paul to Titus, that is a piece of it, but it has a very specific purpose. So why was this letter originally written? So let's look at verse 5 real quick. That'll give us the context. If you're wanting to follow along, we're in the CSB translation. We'll have verses on the screen. You can also follow along in your scripture notebooks or on your phone or whatever you have. So verse 5, we'll get to this next week, but we get to see this hint. It says, the reason I left you in Crete, so this is Paul talking to Titus, was to set right what was left undone. So Paul is building on apparently a previous conversation they had had, a decision that had been made for Titus to stay in Crete. So there were churches that were planted in Crete, and just like anything, the church needed to be maintained and strengthened for it to flourish, right? Personally, I hate maintaining things. I love starting things. You give me something to start, great. But once it's done, I don't want to maintain it. I was really frustrated recently because I finally replaced the blades on my lawnmower, and I was still complaining about it, even though I bought that thing 10 years ago, and I've not replaced the blades once since, or even sharpened them. I figured the grass can sharpen it as it gets cut. Make sure I don't trip over that. So I replaced the blades. It took 2 minutes. I put it off for years because I thought it was going to be a lot of work. And Kevin's like, hey, you can sharpen those things. And I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to pay $30 and replace them. That sounds like work, maintenance. What are we doing? I don't like maintenance, okay? You can judge me if you want. But here's the thing. If you know anything about maintenance, ignoring stuff doesn't make it go away. Things need to be maintained. It just gets worse and worse. And I'm like, okay, well, let's just cover it up and pretend it doesn't exist. You can't do that with the household of faith. You can't do that with the church. Ignoring problems in the church doesn't make them go away. And it leads to a very dysfunctional, disarrayed church, not a healthy church. And so, what's really cool about this letter is for us as a church plant, in many ways, we are in the stages of becoming established, moving a little bit from a plant to being established. God's been gracious to allow us to move to that stage in many ways. And so this letter is essentially Paul giving not necessarily even a church planting manual, but a church establishing manual, saying, hey, here's how a church moves for long-term sustainable health. There are certain things it needs, certain truths it needs to be reminded of. And so that's what Paul is doing. You're going to see it's very blunt. Paul's talking to Titus. It's a friend. He doesn't feel like he's got to sugarcoat things. Throughout the book, you're going to see it. Paul's just kind of line by line, blunt instructions. Here's what needs to happen. Those instructions are what each week we're going to see as we go throughout the book, okay? So we kind of have this church establishing manual from Paul to Titus. Layout of the book, pretty simple. 3 chapters. High level outline, we could obviously fill this out. Chapter 1, though, is essentially about the church's leaders, its elders as they're called. We'll look at that some next week and some of what they're tasked to do. Chapter 2 is primarily about the church's members, the way the churches primarily internally act with each other, the members of the church, the way we treat each other, the way we live with each other. And then chapter 3 is primarily about the way we interact with the world around us. So the church's witness, the way it interacts with those externally, right? Okay. So you kind of see that clear flow there. That's kind of the basic outline of the book. So author Paul, written to Titus, it was written to help him establish these local churches in Crete. There's your basic outline. And then just one more thing I want to cover by way of introduction, and that's looking at the cultural context of Crete, okay? So if you're really bad with geography like me, you're like, where's Crete? And they're like, oh, it's off an island by Greece. And I'm like, I don't know where Greece is. So great. So here's you a map, all right? So this is what I do. I go to Google Maps and find out where it is. And Crete actually still exists today, so it's a little bit easier by that name. It's a little island there in the Mediterranean Sea. You can see, and this was true in Paul's day, very true. It's in a very strategic location right there in the center of a lot happening. And there were a lot of cities in Crete, major cities. It's a pretty big island, a lot of very important harbors. And so Paul says, great place to plant a church, because what happens in Crete spreads to the known world at his day. And so they go and they plant these churches. Very strategic place to plant churches. So Paul and Titus go do this. He leaves Titus. That's kind of the context, okay? But understand this, just because it was a strategic place to plant a church does not mean it was easy. Crete did not have a good reputation at all. It was a very shady place. Crete was known to be a place full of people who were liars, manipulative, sexually immoral. It was so bad, and I'm not making this up, there was an idiom that described someone who was a liar and a manipulator as a Cretan. So you wanted to call somebody a liar, you just called them a Cretan, right? Little racist, but it was what was said, all right? In Greek, it was kretizo is what the word was. And so to call someone a Cretan was an insult. And Paul's even going to build on that in a minute. Kevin gets to handle that tough one. So we'll let him handle that sermon in a couple weeks, right? So that's what's going on. So all of this kind of culture, what it stems from was the idols and the gods that they worshiped, okay? We become like what we worship. The scriptures talk about that. We all become like what we worship. And their primary hero, the story that the Cretans told, was of a god named Zeus. You've probably heard of him. Maybe you've watched Hercules. Unlike the nice little character in Hercules, Zeus was a very manipulative. He was a womanizer. He would say anything, lie. This was the story. I mean, they hear of this. They're like, yeah, he's a liar. He got what he wanted. He got the women. He lied. He manipulated to get his way. And they cheered that on. Like that was a good thing for them. And so, as I said, what you worship is what you become like. And the people of Crete had followed this false mythological god Zeus into this way of living. But Paul still had success planting churches. The gospel began to take root and began to spread. But at some point, between when that happened and when this letter was penned, the Cretan culture had infiltrated the local church, primarily through some false leaders. Now, some of the false leaders would have been licentious, would have taught licentiousness, which is saying, hey, anything goes. Whatever the culture says, we just kind of go with the winds of the culture, and there's no difference between the Cretan culture and the people of God. On the other side of that, Paul's going to address some legalistic leaders. Legalism that says, hey, as a response to that, you know what we're going to do? We're going to make a bunch of rules and say, follow these rules and just stay in line, do what you're supposed to do. And that's how we're going to be godly. But that was just a form of godliness with zero Holy Spirit power is what Paul's going to say. Okay. So these are the two dangers that Paul is addressing. So in the midst of this, Paul speaks to Titus in this open letter that would have been meant to be read at multiple churches on the island of Crete and encourages him, hey, set right what was left undone among the churches, okay? That's context. That's background of the book. Now for the rest of our time, we're going to simply look at these first 4 verses of the chapter that you heard read earlier. What Paul's doing in his introductions, he does this in a lot of his books, he's going to introduce on a very small scale some concepts and ideas that will be covered more fully later in the book. So for our time today, we're going to move pretty quickly through 5 different concepts that I have that Paul kind of introduces and that we'll see, and it'll help us set the stage for our time throughout the book. So let's start by reading the first half of verse 1 again. Paul starts by saying, Paul, and he self-identifies himself as a servant of God and an apostle of Jesus Christ. So the first thing that we see Paul talks about is himself, the person. If you're keeping notes, this is the first of my 5 points, the person. Paul introduces himself first and foremost as a servant of God. This is the Greek word doulos. It's literally translated slave, okay? In our context, it's got a lot of uses. We're going to look at that in a couple weeks. But one thing is clear here, right? Paul is placing himself in surrender and submission to the one true King and Master, God himself. Paul has no problem. He believes that God is a good, wise leader and master. So he says, I surrender, even uses very strong language, enslaving himself to the one true master of all, God himself. So we see Paul's humility here when he refers to himself as a slave or a servant. But we also see Paul's authority. This wasn't just like a false humility. Paul is honest about his role. He goes on to say that he is an apostle of Jesus Christ. Apostle simply means sent one. Now for Paul, this had kind of some special meaning there because he was one of the early church apostles, one of the people that experienced seeing Jesus himself on the Damascus road, being trained up. Other church leaders and apostles affirmed him in his role as a sent one to the Gentiles. So that's Paul's role here as a sent one, an apostle. And so I want you to notice this isn't Paul just trying to brag. If Paul is flexing at all, like his authoritative muscles as an apostle, he's doing it for the sake of Titus. He loves his younger brother in the faith, and he knows that his brother Titus has some difficult conversations probably coming up for the purity and the health of the church. And so in this open letter, he affirms and passes on this same authority to Titus, saying, hey, you're called for this. This is something for the faith of the church that we're going to get to in a second. I am affirming you in this. And so that's the person that we see. The next thing we're going to see is the purpose. Look at Titus 1, verse 1 again, the rest of it. Paul moves from the person to why this is being written. He says, for the faith of God's elect and their knowledge of the truth that leads to godliness. This was not only the purpose of this letter, it was the purpose of Paul's life. So we saw the person, now we see the purpose. Paul says the whole reason for his ministry, and even more specifically for this letter, was for the edification of the church, the people of God. Paul cared deeply about the people of God. First and foremost, he says it is for the faith of God's elect. Those that God had chosen and called, Paul wants them to see them both receive faith, some of them for the very first time, and then for those that had received faith to continue to have that faith grow in them. Paul wants their trust in who God is and what God has done to be strengthened, because he knows that all of us, myself included, we struggle with doubts at times. And so Paul wants our faith to be increased. And along with that, what else does he say? He says he wants them to grow in knowledge of the truth, namely the truth about the good news of Jesus. Notice he doesn't just say growing in knowledge, right? Because we can amass knowledge about a lot of things all day. But he says knowledge about the truth. And he goes on to say that if you want to know if it's really the knowledge of the truth, it will lead to what he calls godliness. That means if someone claims to have a lot of knowledge, but their lives don't reflect the fruit of the Spirit, I've got questions, right? The knowledge of the truth should lead to godliness. And I love how he pairs the knowledge of truth with this godliness. This isn't a form of godliness, as he'll reference later, that has no power, but this is the real thing. Sometimes we hear godly as like, just here's a list of do's and don'ts, but this is literally like, we want to be careful here because we're not gods, but God-like in the sense that we bear the image of God with our lives. That the knowledge of the truth, that the Spirit has caused that to go so deep in our bones, and that the trust and faith that we have in the work of Christ so invades our hearts that it can't help but burst forth into every bit of our being and every way we live. These are lives that have been, to borrow some language he'll use in chapter 2, adorned with the teaching or adorned with the gospel. Again, I love that language because we don't often think of doctrine as beautiful. We typically think of it as some things that we're going to go learn in a class. That can be a piece of it. But Paul says like real doctrine, what we would call orthodoxy, that's what we believe, doctrine, that's where that comes from, is never divorced from orthopraxy, which is what we practice, the way we live, the things we do. Paul never sees those things opposed with each other. You can't separate those off. Those two things flow together. For him, the doctrine, the teaching, the message, the truth was a beautiful thing, and it produced beautiful lives. It's why we're calling this series a flourishing doctrine. Because as the Spirit increases our faith and causes us to understand the truth about who God is, it doesn't just stay in this headspace. It changes us. It transforms us. And our lives, instead of like the lives of the Cretans reflecting this false god of Zeus, our lives by the Spirit of God begin to actually reflect who God is in every piece of our life, both in the public sphere and the private sphere. And so Paul makes clear his purpose. He says, I am writing this. My life is for the faith of God's elect and the knowledge of the truth that leads to godliness. But I love Paul because he can't talk too long without getting to the heart of it. Already in verse 2, like we're in the intro. Like Paul, you'll get to the gospel in a minute, right? No, like, nope, here it is. Look at verse 2. In the hope of eternal life that God, who cannot lie, promised before time began. Paul says, I got a lot of things to say. I got a lot of truth to talk about. I got some tough conversations that need to be had, but I cannot talk about my person, who I am, and my purpose without rooting it in a truth that is far greater than himself. We saw the person, the purpose, now we see the promise. Paul says that the way all of this even begins to happen is God's work. And he says this is a hope that is sure as done. He gives us the who, the person, the why, the purpose, and now he tells us, how does all this happen? What is the power source behind this life of godliness that we're being called to? It is this promise of redemption, what we call the gospel, the good news, the life, death, burial, and resurrection. So first he gives us a future reality of the promise, right? He says there's a hope that is coming, and this hope is of eternal life, and it's as sure as done because it's rooted in the character of God. We talked about this in the Daniel series a lot, right? But the character of God cannot lie. Paul is intentionally placing God in contrast to the false god Zeus, who was a liar, a manipulator. You never knew if he was going to stab you in the back because he just wanted to get what he wanted. He says, God is not like that. He is not like a human. He literally cannot lie, and he promised this hope. What he says is true. So there's a future reality of the promise, but there's also a past reality. Paul says this was promised before time began. Way back in the beginning, like we get to get a glimpse at the way the triune God worked together. That God promised to his son a people from every tribe, tongue, and language, that one day that would be the reward of his suffering. And so the Father promised that to the Son, and the Spirit causes it to come about, both through the cross, death, burial, and resurrection, and through the lives of all of those that are his. This is the triune God working together. And so Paul roots his present admonition. We can't miss this. All the admonition that Paul's going to give throughout this book, it is rooted in a future and a past reality that is bigger than anything we could ever dream up. See, Paul had experienced this. If you know the story of Paul, very familiar story for those of us that have grown up in church. On the Damascus Road, his life was flipped absolutely upside down by the person of Jesus. Like that faith so transformed and changed him that he did not stay the same. You couldn't deny it. And he came to a place by the work of the Spirit in his heart that he actually believed that the person of Jesus and his kingdom was worth giving his entire life to. The promise that Paul speaks of was accomplished solely not by Paul's good works. He called himself the foremost, the chief of all sinners. You think Paul he earned this role? He says, I'm nothing. This is Christ alone. It is his work. Later in this letter, Paul's going to say that we were saved very clearly, not by works of righteousness that we had done, but by the mercy of Christ and the regeneration, renewal, rebirth that the Holy Spirit grants. So do not think at all when we go through Titus, there will be some things he calls us to as a church, but do not think that he is calling you to this in your own strength. Paul is not simply giving you a new list of things to do. Paul makes it clear that all of this is rooted in the work of Christ. This is bigger than you and it's bigger than me, and that's good news because you can't mess it up. This was a culture that viewed authorities and Caesar as ruler and savior and redeemer. They would even apply those godlike titles to him. And Paul says it is Jesus that is the redeemer. He is the one that lived the perfect life. All the things that we're called to in Titus, Jesus did perfectly. He was the perfect shepherd, the perfect brother, the perfect teacher. And with his life, Jesus begins this new creation project. He's making this new humanity made up of people, of Gentiles and Jews and rich and poor and just all these different groups. He brings to the same table and says, you're welcome because I'm making a way for you. The mythical theology of the day that Crete believed in said humans could earn their way to eventually become deities and gods. Is what they thought Zeus did. If they just did enough. What a tired, frustrating life. But in the story of the gospel, the true God becomes man in the person of Christ. And he says, I'm going to sacrifice my life to welcome you into my kingdom. I'm not going to make you try and work and earn endlessly and tirelessly. He says, come to me, all who labor and are weary, and I will give you rest. And he welcomes us, those of us that are like the Cretans, the ones who have lied, who have manipulated, who have cheated, who have stolen, living for our own pleasures. Jesus says, I will become the perfect sacrifice to give you my life, give you my righteousness, and I will take on your sin. And you know what Paul says later in this book? He'll say that through the work of Christ, we become heirs, co-heirs. We get everything that Christ should have had alone. He welcomes us into that, and he says, you get to participate in what I'm doing in the world. And this chiefly happens through Jesus dying on the cross and getting back up out of the grave. See, we can trust his promises that he's going to return and give us eternal life because he already got back up out of the grave and beat sin. He's alive and he's promised to return. And this is what's offered us in the gospel. This is the power source for everything that Paul's going to talk about. You can't skip over this. This is the message that had so smacked Paul in the face, so transformed him that it was the message of his life. You see it in his writings. I love it. Paul would be like even on this list of very practical things that the church needs to know. And like in between it, he goes on this very grammatically incorrect, long run-on sentence about just the magnificent riches and mystery of who Christ is and what he accomplished in his life, death, burial, and resurrection. It's crazy. It's so central to his life, he can't help but talk about it. And our prayer is that this is central to us as a church. That's why we don't just give you a list of do's and don'ts. This promise of a future hope rooted in the past work of God from eternity past, secured for us by the Spirit, making effective the work of Christ in our hearts. This actually changes us. We stake everything on it. We believe that the gospel of Jesus actually changes lives. And so it makes sense what Paul continues to say next. Look at verse 3. He says, in his own time, in God's own time, he has revealed his word, his truth, his message in the preaching with which I was entrusted by the command of God our Savior. So we saw the person, which was the who. We saw the purpose, which was the why. We saw the promise, which was the how, the power. And now we see the what, one of the first two whats that Paul gives us. What is the means by which God has ordained for his gospel to go forth? And so to close this introductory sermon, we get to see two means of grace that God gives to his church, and we still get to participate in this day. And so the first one is preaching. Preaching is one of the means that God uses to grow the faith of his people, to proclaim knowledge of the truth that leads to godliness. Now, I want to explain. When you hear preaching, 99% of you, myself included, our brains go immediately to this right here. Right? This is what we think of when we think of preaching. Now, it's not less than this. This is part of proclaiming the gospel, but it's so much more. This word could easily be translated proclamation. So it simply means that for Paul, his life was one of regularly, whether it be in a setting like this or in a setting around a small group or out in the community, wherever he was, whatever he did, his life was one of speaking with his lips, with words, the good news of Jesus. In another letter, Paul asked the question, how will people hear without one who proclaims, one who speaks, one who preaches? Now for Paul, he had a very specific mandate at a unique time in history to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. But this same call of being a sent one, in one sense, extends to every follower of Jesus. And in this, I'm about to give you some weighty things and call you to a couple things, but here's what I want you to hear. This is to encourage you. See, God is sovereign over the saving of his people, but the sovereign means by which he has chosen to accomplish salvation is through the proclamation, the speaking of the gospel. And Paul never sees those two things at odds with each other. And for me, every time I come across passages like this, I am reminded that I need to speak the good news of Jesus, both to each other and to those who have never heard. To those who've never heard, we offer the life, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And for those who have heard, we offer the same thing. Tell me the old story. Those who know it best seem hungering and thirsting to hear it like the rest, because we need to be reminded of the hope that we have. Paul uses this language very weighty. He says he was entrusted with it. This wasn't because he was special. In fact, in a different letter, Paul says that every single one of you, if you are a follower of Jesus, that you have been given by God a ministry of reconciliation. You want ministry? Best ministry you could ever have. And every single follower of Jesus has it. He says that we are ambassadors of Christ and that God makes his appeal through the words you speak. That's crazy. The creator of the universe, the one who created like the heavens to declare his beauty and his majesty, like the entire cosmos, he says, I'm creating humans, broken, fallen, jacked up humans, and I'm going to make my appeal to the world through your words. Crazy. You might not think you're qualified to speak on behalf of Christ, and on your own you're not, but because of the work of Jesus, he says, I place my stamp of approval on you. You don't have to have it all figured out. It's not about having this perfect presentation. We just say, look, Jesus changed my life, and that's what I have to offer you. By grace alone, we get to participate in what God is doing in the world through the preaching of the gospel. I love this idea that God is making his appeal to those who don't know him, in Decatur, among the unreached, all across the world, through your voices. Be encouraged, church. And this is a necessary means of grace that God has granted us with. We need each other to speak life when we're struggling with our faith and doubts. We need each other. But we have to also understand, for Paul, it wasn't just about like going on a street corner and proclaiming, all right? In his context and day, he probably did that some. Now, like go on Facebook is like the current public square, right? It wasn't Paul just walking about preaching and then his life was kind of over here divorced from his message. You have to understand that Paul did not separate the two. He lived this. This was in his bones. His words was just a flowing out of who Christ had made him to be. Look at Titus 1:4. He says to Titus, my true son in our common faith, my true child, grace and peace from God, the Father, familial language, and Christ Jesus, our Savior, our Redeemer. See, this message for Paul was not just something to talk about. As we mentioned earlier, it transformed him. He lived it out. We saw the person, the purpose, the promise, the preaching, and last, the partnership. I rarely have this many points, but it just worked out that way. We see this in the way that he refers to Titus as his true son in their common faith. In 2 Corinthians, Paul talks about Titus, and he actually uses the language of partner. See, for Paul, this was a life-on-life sort of relationship. You don't refer to somebody as your son, right? Because it's weird, okay? Unless you're like trying to trash talk them or something. But like, you don't say like, hey, most y'all didn't get that. I don't know, y'all need to play more basketball with this. All right. So you don't refer to somebody as your son because it's weird unless like you actually, and they actually believe that that's the relationship you have. He says, my true son. This bond was stronger than a biological tie. This was a spiritual relationship that only the gospel could form. And Paul's going to reference like church fathers and mothers and older women and younger men and that later. But right here, we get to see Paul living this life. This was real to him. Like when Paul was serving at the church of Ephesus and he had to move on, it says that they literally cried on his shoulder. Like we can see Paul as this like strong, bold theologian. Like Paul wept with people and shepherded people and taught them the gospel, not just with his lips, with his words, but also with his life. See, the real and true gospel can never stay just as spoken or written words. If it's truly believed, it will be lived out. I also love the way Paul refers to Titus in this very honorable way. He says, our common faith. Yeah, Paul was this great apostle, called by God to do great things, to write most of the New Testament. But he says, hey, at the cross, Like we're all level. Like he says, common faith, me and you, Titus, together. He encourages him and affirms him together. We're seeking to simply edify and grow the faith of the church. See, along with the means that God gives us of growing our faith through proclamation, we also need to see it side by side lived out. We need spiritual fathers and mothers, which encourage me in my journey as I watch people who just have more experience with the faithful God than I do. So when my faith is wavering, I'm like, man, I know you say it's gonna work out, but I don't know. Like when I can see and feel it and it's tangible, like I need that in my life. And older men and women need younger men and women to pour into and continue to like have the zeal of faith that's just so almost innocent. Like let's go take over the world for Jesus. Like we need those arm in arm together with our common faith. Almost every person I've met who came to faith eventually believed because they knew someone who had a life so transformed that only God could get credit. And my prayer for us in the way we live our lives, my prayer for myself is that even if people don't immediately believe, like everything we believe, that they at least believe that we believe it. That they can't deny that it's real. That Jesus is all we have, and that our lives actually reflect that. It's not just using the Bible to get our own way and amass power and fight cultural wars, but like deep in our bones, we say, Jesus is all we have. And not perfectly, our lives are not perfect, but by God's grace, we are slowly and humbly, day by day, actually being transformed into the image of Christ. And it's a lifelong journey. But my prayer is that our church and our communities, our people, our members of our body, that we exude godliness, real spirit-empowered godliness, because you can't fake that. Not self-righteousness, not an empty piety, but true godliness that loves its neighbors and even its enemies. That like Christ sacrifices for others and calls the least of these to come feast at a table. That proclaims good news, that partners with others for kingdom advancement, that weeps with those that weep and celebrates with those that are rejoicing, that both sins and goes to the nations to see the gospel be furthered among the unreached, that seeks mercy and justice in our communities, everything from our private little small micro to the big scale thing, all for the building up of the faith of God's people and the glory of God among all people. That's what Paul was after. And this letter will go on to explore this in more detail. Remember, Paul's goal here is for the church to be built up and encouraged. Paul is writing this letter in a tough world, right? The island of Crete. There was a lot going on, a lot of cultural pressures, and there's a lot of pressures in our day. But Paul knew that Jesus was not only worth it, but that the Spirit would build his church. This is not on you to have it all figured out. It's not on us. It is on God, and he will do his work. He will build his church, and the means by which he does his work in the world is through you, the church, which is crazy. In another letter, Paul says that it's the church that proclaims the magnificent glory of Christ among the heavenly beings and deities. And you're like, what? There's people that are like, look at those people in Decatur, Alabama. God is so good, right? But it's true. And you are not alone. It's why we need each other. We're gonna see it in Titus. You are not left to your own devices. You have each other proclaiming the gospel, partnering together. And when your faith seems to be waning, because it will happen at some point in your life, you're gonna get smacked in the face. And sometimes when we fall to temptation and our lives seem to reflect false gods more than Jesus, you're not alone. We're here, true sons and daughters and fathers and mothers in the common faith, picking each other up, flesh and blood, tangible, reminding us of the purpose and promise of God. He will keep you. This was promised before time began. He will complete the good work he started in you. So as we interact with this book, my prayer is that our lives begin to further display a flourishing doctrine. Not just words on a page, but a vibrant, life-giving message that adorns or makes attractive the gospel of Jesus, our Lord and Savior. So I look forward to going on this journey together with each of you.